chapel down there. The confusion stems from the fact that we're not having the actual big party this year. The people who were guests at our party are being transitioned out of ECS's service by reduction of funds by the City Department of Housing and Urban Development, and also HHS. So what we're doing instead this year is buying very specific home cleaning and kitchen setup supplies for the 35 families that are being moved into alternate housing. So that's what the tags on the trees are. And we've also added stuffed animals and a couple of family game ideas for the kids in the family. So please be sure to take a tag. No need to sign out, no need to keep track of you. Just bring them in between now and December 2nd, and we're going to put together 35 laundry baskets of cleaning supplies, kitchen supplies, bathroom towels, and a few little things for the kids. And they'll be much appreciated and well used. So thank you very much for your participation.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Mimi. All right. My name is Roger Clark. I'm a longtime member here of the 8 o'clock service primarily. Wife Nancy and 2 boys. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. James Como to all of you. Jim's website has a banner that describes him as consultant, lecturer, writer, and teacher. And we're going to benefit from all of those different perspectives in his talk this morning that's entitled C.S. Lewis and the Centrality of Hope. Jim earned advanced degrees in medieval English literature from Fordham University, in public and group communication from Queens College, and a PhD in language, literature, and rhetoric from Columbia University. In 1968, he joined the faculty of York College, the City University of New York, where he founded the speech discipline and thereafter chaired the Department of Performing and Fine Arts for 15 years. Jim just retired from full-time teaching in 2012, but I expect you're more busy than before, so still on the road and talking about C.S. Lewis and other issues as well. Jim's been a C.S. Lewis fan since he was an undergraduate. For a class, he read a book that just blew his mind, and he was in love, and has been growing since. Soon after he started, I mentioned he formed that C.S. Lewis Society of New York. He's written a number of books. Where do I have all those? Oh, here we go. I brought a couple of book covers just so you can get a little feel of it. Branches to Heaven, which was reviewed very favorably as a groundbreaking study of Lewis as a rhetorician, remembering C.S. Lewis, which is a series of interviews Jim did with people who actually knew C.S. Lewis, so it's personal reminiscences and so on. He has a new book coming out in January called C.S. Lewis, A Very Short Introduction, so it's going to be available, and I think we have some forms on that. Bill's got those. If anyone wants those, grab them on the way out. And then the Folk Tales of Brusco and Giovanni, book 1, 2, 3. Are we up to 4 yet?
No, book 1 and 2. 3 is
1 and 2, okay. A series of children's stories. And there are several others and articles and so on. If you want to know more about Jim, go to his website, jimcomo.com. Very easy to understand. JamesComo.com. Okay.
Roger,
yes.
Reading into my time.
I'm sorry, he's married, his wife Alexandra's here, they have 2 kids and 2 grandchildren, and that's Jim Como. Thank you.
Very cognizant of the time I have and don't have, so thank you very much, Roger, that was generous, and thank you for having me today. This will be something of a meditation. And as such, it's a work in progress, and in some ways, very personal. It traces Lewis's impact on me, but also my claim is that what has impacted me so greatly is also what is central to Lewis's own spirituality and to his vocation as an apologist. I'm also mindful of the fact that today is not only Veterans Day, which I mention because, as many of you probably know, but all of you should know, Lewis was a veteran of that war and fought in the trenches, and as he writes himself, saw his sergeant, who really saw him through, blown up right next to him by the same shell that wounded him and left fragments in his body for the rest of his life. So we tend to think that Lewis had an uneventful life, and in some ways it was an uneventful life. I mean, we college professors don't have much events, you know, so his life was uneventful. But then again, you see, every life is a mystery. John Keats wrote a letter to his brother. It's an allegory that no one can read. It's like the scriptures that no one can figure out. And Lewis was no different. Now, my dear wife Alexandra has often opined, really she has accused me, of turning every talk on Lewis that I give into a sermon. I'm not prepared to dispute that. I just don't intend it, but maybe it does become that. However, since this may be a sermon, how better to begin than with a quotation from Scripture, which all good preachers know to do, because it really is one of the touchstones, scriptural touchstones to C.S. Lewis. And this is from 2 Corinthians 4. Therefore we are not discouraged. Rather, although our outer self is wasting away, to C.S. Lewis, of course, who knew that well, knew Scripture well. But which C.S. Lewis? I know some of you may have heard my good friend Lex McMillan give the first of these lectures, where he talked about Lewis's biography. And you may, if you recall that, have gotten the impression that there are many C.S. Lewises. There's the penetrating religious thinker, Promethean literary historian and critic. He was simply the gold standard of medieval English literature studies in his day. He was the man you had to match. Public intellectual, broadcaster, preacher, wonderful sermons, university megastar, and I mean a megastar. Some of you may know that in Oxford, attendance at lectures is not compulsory. For example, Lewis's great friend Tolkien was such a bad lecturer. I was told this authoritatively that on some occasions he actually lectured to an empty room. The opposite was true of C.S. Lewis. If you've ever been to one of the lecture halls at an Oxford college, they sweep up, and there literally are rafters, and students would climb up and sit on the sills and hold the rafters to hear C.S. Lewis speak. I mean, he really packed them in. Of course, we know him as an incantatory storyteller, not only Narnia, which most of us know, but the space trilogy, so-called, from the late 30s to the later 40s, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength, which really do deserve to be better known, especially by readers of Lewis. We do know that Lewis was a great conversationalist, one of the greatest conversationalists in Oxford at the time, which is saying a lot, by the way, and also a prolific, articulate, eloquent letter writer. His 3 volumes of letters, edited by Walter Cooper, stretched to 4,000 pages. At one point, he was getting hundreds of letters a week when he became famous, all asking for help, because most of these letters provide pastoral care to the letter writer. He answered every single letter he received, with the great help of his brother Warren. His older brother Warren was his best friend. But these letters are almost a second C.S. Lewis. And if you really want to read the caring, penetrating, helpful C.S. Lewis, that's where you'll find him, in the letters. But there's another Lewis. And I want to introduce you to this other Lewis. This is part of a poem called The Day with the White Mark, not published during his lifetime. All day I have been tossed and whirled in a preposterous happiness, Was it an elf in the blood, or a bird in the brain, or even part of the cloudily crested 50-league-long, loud, uplifted wave of a journeying angel's transit, roaring over and through my heart? My garden is spoiled. My holidays are canceled. The omens harden. The planned and unplanned miseries deepen. The knots draw tight. Reason kept telling me all day my mood was out of season. It was, too. In the dark ahead, the breakers only are white. Yet I could have kissed the very scullery taps. The color of my day was like a peacock's chest. In at each sense there stole ripplings and dewy sprinkles of delight that with them drew fine threads of memory through the vibrant thickness of the soul. Who knows if ever it will come again, now the day is closed. No one can give me or take away that key. All depends on the elf, the bird, or the angel. I doubt if the angel himself is free to choose when sudden heaven and man begins or ends. Sudden heaven, beginning or ending. That was Lewis as a grown-up. The next little bit I want to quote from Lewis comes from a poem he wrote 20 years before that, when he was, as I'm sure you know, an atheist. In fact, Lewis called himself a blaspheming atheist. When he writes about his experience in the war, he said, like everyone else, he was frightened every second of his life. But, and this is Lewis, I never sank so low as to pray. So that's a pretty convinced atheist. A year before that, he would write a poem that would be published. His first published work, Spirits in Bondage, has this line. This is from an atheist. Well, this is from a man who thought he was an atheist. Our vision still, one moment was enough. We know we are not made of mortal stuff, for we have seen the glory. We have seen. Now, I have to ask what kind of an atheist writes that sort of thing. It's the kind of man who would write The Day with the White Mark 20 years later and much else. Such evocations are ubiquitous in Lewis. And as I've claimed, they are central to him and to us. They're my subject for today. That is heaven. Heaven. From the beginning that you heard Lewis just write as a 19-year-old, and earlier, as we shall see, to the very end, the last book he saw through the press just before he died. A constant thread in him. But what about reason? Many of us enjoy Lewis because he was this wonderful debater. He had a great command of logic. He was president of the Socratic Club, where they took on all comers, atheists, to debate C.S. Lewis. You know who wouldn't go to debate C.S. Lewis? A name that will resonate, I'm sure, with many people here. Bertrand Russell wouldn't go to the Socratic Club because he didn't want to debate C.S. Lewis, a famous atheist, Bertrand Russell, right, about Christianity. So that was Lewis's reputation. He wrote the following poem called Reason. Who will make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight? Then could I truly say, and not deceive, then wholly say that I believe. So he wanted to marry what you've heard so far, this sudden eruption of joy, which is the presence of heaven, with logic. And of course, Lewis was one of the most logical, rational people in Oxford at the time. We see that in Mere Christianity. I'm sure many have read Mere Christianity, where his reason, at the very beginning of that book, it's so astonishingly modest, and yet it leads to so much by way of his logic. We have all heard people quarreling. And from that one sentence, we have all heard people quarreling, he evokes natural law and finally the existence of God. Jesus comes later. But it all begins with, we have all heard people quarreling. Very interesting. Some of you may have seen the movie Shadowlands. It goes back now about 25 years. Anthony Hopkins played C.S. Lewis, and Deborah Winger played Joy Davidman. And I had the great privilege of being on the set there the last day of shooting, which wasn't the last scene in the movie. Of course, movies, as you know, are shot out of sequence. And I saw the shooting of that sequence. It took all day to shoot and lasted 15 seconds on screen. And that's astonishing. But I did have the opportunity, both then and thereafter, to interview some of the principals, including Hopkins, who was a very commanding figure, a really, I mean, those penetrating blue eyes that look through the bars in Silence of the Lambs, that's what you see when you look at Anthony Hopkins. Big chest, broad shoulders. And I read to Anthony Hopkins a very nasty quotation about Lewis attributed to him. And before I went to print with this, I wanted to confirm this. It was in W, Women's Wear Daily, W. And I read this quotation. I said, Sir Anthony, would you mind? And as I read it, he leaned, he was all dressed in black, his hair buzz cut, gray hair, he's looking at me, thinking of fava beans, And he looked at me, really leaning across the table, and he said, "Who wrote that?" And I held the magazine at arm's length, and they said, "She did." It's her. And he read the byline, and he said, "That blank lies about everything. I love Lewis." Oh, I'm so happy. But then Deborah Winger joined the table, and she started to talk a good deal about Joy and Lewis, and she was mostly right. Now, I'm at this table not because I'm a movie reporter, right? But because I know Lewis. That's my standing there. Everybody else is going to write a column on the movie. Eventually, she started to say some things that I knew were false. So I interrupted her. I said, "Miss Davison, Miss Winger, rather, I just have to correct you. He didn't do that. He did this." And she looked at me with real anger, and I was so pleased to be the center of attention for this intensity of passion from Deborah Winger. And she said, "So we know a lot about C.S. Lewis, do we?" And I said in my naivete, "Well, actually, yes, I do." At the end of the session, she allowed everyone else to take a photograph of her except for me. She wouldn't allow it. However, she has said one of the most intelligent things about Lewis's approach to apologetics that I have ever read. It's this. Somebody asked her at the table, "Doesn't he give simplistic answers to questions?" And she said, "Oh, no, he never gives simplistic answers to questions." By the way, she's not a Christian. She wasn't and she isn't. He makes difficult questions accessible. I don't think he makes the answers easy. I don't think he answers questions. I think he discusses them. He's in that school of discourse where his statements are not like books that are written by experts. He's saying, think about this. That's why I think he opened Christianity to so many people. And she's right. Lewis goes from the possible to the plausible, like in the book Miracles, for example, to the pleasurable. He makes the plausible attractive. Then promising, wouldn't you like this? It's available to you. And then to glory. And I mean in very odd places he does this, heavily laden theological places. For example, the problem of pain. I don't know how many of you have read that book. It's his first theological book out in 1938, nonfiction. And of course he addresses the question, if God is a loving God, why does he allow so much pain? Many of us think his answer is not quite successful. but it's one of the better answers we have. So it's thick, heavy going. But the last chapter, tellingly, is called Heaven. And he writes the following: "The thing you long for summons you away from the self. There is," and now comes the magic word for C.S. Lewis, "there is joy in the celestial dance." Dance being an image that he loved and would go back to again and again. It is love himself and good himself, and therefore happy. An odd ending for a book called The Problem of Pain, but it harkens back to that snippet of poetry he wrote when he was 19. It harkens back to The Day with the White Mark, and it harkens forward to the book which would be his spiritual autobiography called Surprised by Joy. Some people get confused by that book because he writes it almost as he's meeting Joy Davidman. And actually many people did think it was a book about his meeting Joy Davidman, but it has nothing to do with the woman who would become his wife. It's about this extraordinary experience of joy that he would have his whole life. Maybe he was a mystic. Some people, my colleague David Downing has a wonderful book called Into the Region of Awe, where he examines Lewis as a mystic. And I'm among those who think that although he would deny it, well, he actually said there are levels of mysticism. He didn't deny that he didn't claim he had no such experience, just that he wasn't there with St. Teresa or St. John of the Cross. But this is from a letter about mysticism. There is no reasoning in it, but many would say it is an experience of the intellect, the reason resting in its mystical enjoyment of its object. Which sounds like a self-description to me. Now, where do we find, other than my opening quotation, where do we find in Scripture touchstones for Lewis's thinking? Psalm 45, "You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with," does anyone recall the phrase that comes next? "The oil of gladness." Oil of gladness beyond your companions. And in 1 Thessalonians, we read, "Let us put on faith and love for a breastplate and the hope of salvation for a helmet." In that light, consider a very little-known essay by Lewis. Little known, he wrote it in 1945. It's been anthologized obscurely twice, and scholars don't refer to it. Even people who are steeped in Lewis just don't refer to it. It's called Hedonics, a play on the word hedonism, seeking pleasure and pleasure alone. And he suggests in this essay the need for a philosophy of hedonism. But what kind of hedonism is he talking about? He recalls an experience on a train when he's returning to Oxford from London. And he can't understand why the suburbs, as he calls them, as we call them, have gotten such a bad reputation. Because he loves the suburbs. He says, look at all those vales, all those woods, all those doorways, all the people coming home to their families and to the love of their families. I really don't know how anybody manages to live in London. They should all be leaving London and coming to these places. And suddenly he's filled, as in The Day with the White Mark, this inexplicable feeling of great happiness, with all the caress of a half-remembered piece of music, like an invitation to Eden, the tingling, passing into a state which can only be described as joy. So this would happen to Lewis again and again and again. And he would wonder how many people felt it, but were embarrassed by it, because it seemed adolescent, or sentimental, or owing to bad digestion, or to wishful thinking. Lewis says, no, you should not be. In Mere Christianity, the section on hope in Mere Christianity is about nothing other than heaven. And in that chapter, he talks about the great reformers, the great builders of the Middle Ages, the great reformers, English reformers who ended the slave trade, they all sought the glory of heaven. Their eyes were fixed on heaven. They did hear what they accomplished because there was calling them to do it. Oh, this business about the imagery, nobody took that literally. You know, the images of glory about light. Who wants to be a blazing light bulb anyway? You know, Lewis would say. And when he tells us to be as gentle as doves, do you really think we're supposed to go around laying eggs? No, of course not. You know, that's not what joy is about, and it's not what heaven is about. When he was a young boy, very young, 3 or 4 years old, you know, he was a very precocious boy. When he was about 5, he announced to his father that he had a prejudice against the French. His father said, Jaxie, which was his boyhood name, you know, he would be known as Jack his whole adult life. Nobody called him Clive. He was offered a knighthood by the Churchill government, which he turned down, he said, because I would not be Sir Clive. I could never be Sir Clive. So the father said, Jaxie, why do you have a prejudice against the French? And the little boy said, well, Father, if I knew the answer to that, it wouldn't be a prejudice, would it? So you have this very thoughtful, very intelligent, very cheeky kid who will go into a very thoughtful, very intelligent, very cheeky adult. But on one occasion, his brother, whom he was devoted to, best friends, his brother brought him the lid of a biscuit tin. And he had put some leaves and twigs in there and called it a garden. And he presented it to Lewis. And Lewis was stunned by it, just stunned by it. And it seemed to take him out of himself into another world. And he would say, I expect until the day I die, my conception of heaven will to some degree include that garden, that toy garden. As a very young boy, 4 or 5 years old, he already had some dim intuition, not rational, but imaginative, of what heaven was and what it was doing to him. It's that boy who would write the poem as a 19-year-old atheist that I read you part of. It's that boy who would go into a man and write The Day with the White Mark. It's that man who would write The End of the Problem of Pain. It's that man who would tell us in Mere Christianity about the appeal of heaven and the importance of heaven. That unsatisfied desire which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy. He read George MacDonald's Fantastes as an atheist. And he was 16 years old. He found the book at a train station. Very, I don't know if any of you have read it. It's a hard book to recommend because if you do, you might be blamed later on. But it's a wonderful book if you stick with it. This atheist says, MacDonald baptized my imagination. It taught me holiness. So it would take a long time for things to happen in Lewis. It gets me to what I consider the essential scriptural passage when it comes to Lewis, Romans 15. May the God of hope bring you such joy and peace in your faith that the power of the Holy Spirit will remove all bounds to hope. And it seems to me that that's what C.S. Lewis was doing his whole life. Or Isaiah 6, to grant to those who mourn in Zion the oil of gladness, again, the oil of gladness, instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit. It's interesting to note images of evil in C.S. Lewis. There is evil in his book. If any of you have read Paralandra, you've met the unmanned, horrifying creature, a horrifying creature. But there's nothing in Lewis that comes close to Jonathan Edwards. I'm sure some of you have read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is not only a very great sermon, but happens to be my personal favorite. I always wish that William Friedkin, who did The Exorcist, had filmed Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where the bow of God's wrath is bent, the arrow poised at your heart, ready to be made drunk with your blood. There is no reason why you do not now, this very moment, drop down into hell, for God hates you. Oh, that's preaching. But nothing like it in C.S. Lewis. Nothing like it. He gets into the spiritual demonism that's behind that. But no image as repellent as that. At the end of that chapter on hope, in Mere Christianity, Lewis says, I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same. Narnia, of course, we see that in The Magician's Nephew. Do you remember when Aslan is singing Narnia into creation? Just one of the glorious passages of English literature. And Frank the cabbie is there, and he sees Narnia happening. The stars are coming out. And Frank says, glory be. I'd have been a better man all my life if I'd have known there were things like this. And later on, at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Aslan tells the children they will not be coming back. And Lucy, one of the great creations in my opinion, really, other than Aslan, the hero of the Chronicles, cries, and Aslan says, come on. She says, it isn't Narnia, you know. It's you. And how can we live never meeting you? And Aslan assures her that even though she won't come back to Narnia, she will meet him again. He would say, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen. This is one of the 5 most famous quotes of C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So this glory emanating from heaven enlightens us, and the world takes on a different aspect. For example, the scullery taps. I could have kissed the very scullery taps. Do you remember 2 Corinthians, the phrase, the weight of glory? Well, the seminal sermon by C.S. Lewis, the seminal passage by C.S. Lewis, is from a sermon called The Weight of Glory that he delivered in 1939. If there were people who wanted to know of Lewis as a religious writer and thinker, and I could only recommend one thing, I wouldn't recommend Screwtape or Mere Christianity, or even my favorite, The Great Divorce. You know, Screwtape and The Great Divorce, if you know them, are very dangerous because you will meet yourself in those books. You really will meet yourself in those books. And I read both as a younger man, and boy, did I meet myself. And then 30 years later, I met myself again, but different character, you know, so those books are dangerous. But the essay called The Weight of Glory is not dangerous. He says, after combining all these imagery of glory, do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am, but remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments too, to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness. Do you remember that scene in the underworld when the children with Puddleglum are trying to free Prince William, and the witch finds them, and she's weaving a spell to convince them that there's no such thing as Narnia, there's no such thing as Aslan, and it's successful. It's successful. Until Puddleglum steps on the fire and burns himself. And Lewis says, nothing will bring you to your senses faster than the smell of burning marsh wiggle. Puddleglum is a marshmallow. And that's when they remember, you see, that what they believe to be real is actually an evil spell that they're awakening from. And Puddleglum gives that great proclamation of faith. I believe in Narnia. I believe in Aslan, even if there is no Aslan. I'm on his side, even if he doesn't exist. So, with your permission, Your Majesty, if you don't mind, we'll just be leaving now. And they go up back to Narnia. So, spells, you see, are good for breaking incantations as well as casting them. And he says, all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. The weight of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back. Four very famous phrases. There are no ordinary people, for you have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortal horrors or splendors that we joke with, marry, snub, or exploit. Here we see Lewis proclaiming this hope for the glories of heaven, hope beckoning from heaven, which he was so wonderful at conveying to us. He thought at the core of his vocation, in the preface to Mere Christianity, he says, it occurred to me that I could do nothing better than to help my fellows see what I've seen. And thus he made those famous broadcasts that became Mere Christianity, which cost him, by the way. His life as a Christian, especially at Oxford, which was not Christian at all, was costly to us. And I would say, so not only is it the core of his own spirituality, but the core of his vocation and the core of his appeal to us. In Surprised by Joy, he writes, into the region of awe, in deepest solitude, there is a road right out of the self, a commerce with the naked other, imageless, though our imagination salutes it with 1,000 images, unknown, undefined, but so long desired. Now, I've tried to sum this up in an awkward way with a diagram. You can see at the top that it all begins where it should begin. It begins in heaven. And heaven beckons. Heaven beckons through nature, through scripture and tradition, through arts and literature especially, C.S. Lewis, through mystics and through myths, which Lewis loved. And in beckoning, it sends out longing, joy, awe, and desire. That's heaven calling us. And here's where Lewis dwells, because Lewis transmits or translates to us longing, joy, awe, and desire, the glories that heaven promises. And if it works, if you're receptive, it leads to hope. And that hope, we hope, gets us back to heaven. So, my claim is that Lewis knew this from the start. When he saw that toy garden, he knew it as an atheist when he wrote that verse. In World War I, he knew it when he wrote the poem A Day with the White Mark, when he wrote the end of the problem of pain. He knows it in Narnia. And, you know, there are so many passages that you could quote from Narnia about hope and salvation. But I won't. I won't do that. Instead, I'll quote from a book that many people haven't read, that I mentioned earlier, called Perelandra. It is the second in the trilogy involving Elvin Ransom, who is his hero who goes to battle cosmic forces in outer space. First to Mars, Malacandra, then to Venus, Perelandra, and finally, in a horrifying book, on Earth. But this is from near the end of Perelandra, and really is a piece of writing which comes very close, I think, to showing us Lewis the mystic. This is Ransom hearing a song on this unspoiled planet that he has helped save. Where Mal-el-Dil is the creator of the universe. Where Mal-el-Dil is, there is the center. He is in every place. Not some of him in one place and some in another, but in each place the whole Mallarville, even in the smallness beyond thought. There is no way out of the center save into the bent will which casts itself into the nowhere. Blessed be he. Each thing was made for him. He is the center because we are with him. Each of us is at the center. It is not as if a city of the darkened world where they say that each must live for all. In his city all things are made for each. When he died in the wounded world, here, he died not for men, but for each man separately. If each man had been the only man made, he would have died no less. He has immeasurable use for each thing that is made, that his love and splendor may flow forth like a strong river which has need of great watercourse and fills alike the deep pools and the little crannies that are filled equally and remain and make new channels. We also have need beyond measure of all that he has made. Love me, my brothers, for I am infinitely necessary to you, and for your delight I was made. Blessed be he. Personal, Lewis's impact, I think, is ultimately very intimate and very personal, but that's, in my view, as good a prayer as you could utter. And it's from a work of science fiction, of all things. When he was near death, Walter Hooper, who was his last secretary, was present in the house. And Walter would have to come back to America. Walter Hooper was the great Lewis scholar and editor. Had to come back to finish teaching. So he wasn't present when Lewis died, but he was present when Lewis was getting very sick. And at one point, he reports that Lewis, almost in a daze, rose from his sickbed and began to take a few steps forward, looking into the distance. Walter was just a spectator here. And Lewis said, with his eyes growing, according to Walter, "Oh, I never imagined. What must Lewis have been seeing then? Well, I can hypothesize that he was seeing what I've been talking about, and what he had been seeing since he was 4 years old, and saw that toy garden. You know, of course, that Lewis died the same day as President Kennedy. Probably the same hour as Kennedy. So very few people heard that Lewis had died, because the news across the world was elsewhere. Not many people were at his funeral, but one man was a student named Peter Bailey. And Peter Bailey wrote this. There was one candle on the coffin as it was carried out into the churchyard. It seemed not only appropriate, but almost a symbol of the man and his integrity and his absoluteness and his faith, that the flame burned so steadily, even in the open air, and seemed so bright, even in the bright sun. Before that moment, Lewis had seen through the press his final book, that is the final book published during his lifetime, or shortly after his lifetime, called Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer. Very accessible book, very easy book to read. They're supposed to be letters to his friend Malcolm. There is no Malcolm, and these weren't actual letters. But at the end of that book, he says the following. Now, please keep in mind the boy looking at that toy garden, the atheist writing that he's seen the glory just before he's wounded in the foxhole, the man writing the day with the white mark, the man who ends a problem of pain with an image of heaven, and so on, as I tried to trace. What will happen after we're gone, he asks Malcolm. And then he answers the question. I don't say the resurrection of this body will happen at once. It may well be that this part of us sleeps in death, and the intellectual soul is sent to Lenten lands where he fasts in naked spirituality, a ghost-like and imperfectly human condition. Then, the new earth and sky, think of the end of Narnia, when Narnia ends, but a new Narnia actually arises. Then the new earth and sky, the same yet not the same as these, will rise as in us we rise in Christ and he in us. And once again, the birds will sing, and the waters flow, and lights and shadows move across the hills, and the faces of our friends laugh upon us with amazed recognition. Guesses, of course, only guesses. If they are not true, something better will be. Hebrews 11 tells us, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What Lewis gives us near the end of Letters to Malcolm is the signature line of Lewis, which I'll end with. It was the story of his spiritual life. It's the story of his vocation, and in my opinion, it's the story of his impact on each and every person who lends himself or himself to Lewis. Joy, he says, the key word. Joy is the serious business of heaven. Joy is the serious business of heaven. Thank you all very much.
You understand everybody has schedules, and if you need to get up and leave, feel free to do so. No foul about that. However, Jim's available for some questions, and so we can continue until we decide we're ready to stop.
I have a question. Is this chart in any of your books?
No. You're welcome to take a picture of it if you want. You know, on your phone. Maybe it'll be in the next one. I don't draw them very well, as you can see, but I do think it describes diagrammatically what's going on with Lewis, because he really was in touch. He had the fast lane to heaven and was determined to bring it to us so that we would inspire hope and get us back to heaven with him. That was his mission, that was his vocation. You can ask if Roger, if I don't know the answer, I'll make something up.
There we go. Exactly.
Yes, sir.
Those little glimmers of joy and beauty and so on that Lewis felt and was responsive to and accepted in himself. What does he say? How can we do that? What is it we can do to prepare for it? When it happens, what should we be doing according to him?
That's a very good question, which Lewis himself asked and answered. And the answer is nothing. And he means that Lewis had a mental rule called the law of inattention. You know how Uncle Screwtape tells his nephew Wormwood, when your patient, that's one of us, as you know, when your patient is at worship, tell him to pay attention to his own feelings, so that if he doesn't feel reverent or devout, he'll think there's something wrong with the pastor, the liturgy, or himself. And of course, the point is, if you want to feel devout, don't pay attention to whether or not you feel devout, but pay attention to the source of devotion, namely our Lord. That will make you feel devout. So, I think what Lewis might say is, you know, Scripture, art, myths, nature, these will, my wife instructed me, I obey. These are what will bring that about. But he also adds something else for us. Don't second guess yourself when it happens.
Yep.
Don't dismiss it as wishful thinking or adolescence. Lewis has a wonderful line. People want to put us in prison. And people in prison, and he thinks we are in prison, they dream of freedom. They dream of what's out there. And people often say, when you have these feelings, when you read fairy tales, when you read the Chronicles of Narnia, it's all wishful thinking. It's escapism. Escapism. And Lewis asks, the only people really interested in escape are jailers. They're the ones trying to keep you inside. rather than you leaving because you're following what he called the dialectic of desire. You have this desire, and you'll try to satisfy it in many ways, sex, money, family love, sports, whatever, but they fail, you see, because they're not the drink given for this particular thirst. Only heaven is that particular drink that will solve it. And just how strange it is to have a world of people who get thirsty. Wouldn't you expect there to be water in such a world? Well, he says all of us are thirsty in ways that we sometimes don't recognize. Because as Augustine says at the beginning of the Confessions, each of us are born with that hole that only God can fill. Joy will let you know that there's something available to fill it. Yes?
Did you feel the Shadowlands was pretty good and pretty accurate? And I found it very moving, and I can't think of C.S. Lewis as anybody but Anthony.
You know what? I want to see you behind the gym at 3 o'clock. That's what we're gonna duke this out. No, I did not like the movie Shadowlands at all. It was fraudulent in too many ways. And you know what really annoyed me? At the very beginning of the movie, there's a legend at the bottom of the screen that says, "This is a true story." Not based upon a true story. And I spoke to a guy named Bill Nichols, who wrote the play and the movie. And I said, what inspired you to write this? And then he gave the answer, which I always think is deadly. Oh, Lewis reminded me of me. You know, so I didn't say it because he's being very polite to me. I thought, oh, so, you know, this is a little vanity project of yours, right? I said, how so? And then he said something which, honest to goodness, is the height of stupidity. Because like me, Lewis did not know suffering until his 40s. And this is a man who was in a trench next to a sergeant who was blown, you know, who was wounded, whose mother died when he was, this guy didn't know suffering. And Nichols knew this. I mean, it was just so shocking. Now, some of you may know the name John Simon. John Simon is a movie and literary critic, one of the most acerbic, nastiest critics who ever walked the earth. So nasty that somebody he criticized once dumped a bowl of spaghetti on his head when she saw him in a restaurant. He said her performance was terrible, I had to leave after 10 minutes. And somebody said, well, then how did you know it was so terrible? He said, well, how many spoonfuls of rancid soup do you have to drink before you know the whole bowl is rancid? Plop. That was Sylvia Miles, by the way, who did that to her. So that's John Simon. Now, I went to a private screening of Shadowlands when it came out. And at the end, you know, there's this sun-drenched meadow, and Lewis is kind of trotting down the meadow. And after him comes the boy. There were really two sons, but they only have one in the movie. After him, running. And if that's not enough, running after the boy is a cute little yapping puppy. You know, it can get sappier, but it would be hard. There was one person crying in that movie theater, and it was John Simon. Of all people, John Simon was crying by it. I love Hopkins. I don't think he gave a particularly good, you know, Jack was all kind of beaten down. Even after Joy died, Lewis almost married again after Joy died. He wasn't a beaten down soul. So I like Deborah Winger very much. And I met Richard Attenborough, who directed it. And I've never met a greater gentleman in my life. So it was hard to give it a bad notice. But just didn't. Now, the play has been revived off-Broadway. It's now finished its run. And Alexandra and I went to see Shadowlands on Broadway again after 25 years. And it was impressive. And there's a young woman named Robin Abramson who played Joy, who was just superb. They were all great. It was wonderful. And it seemed to me to get to the heart of the love story. We'll forget a lot else, but let's make this true, and it did. Yes, sir.
Can you expand a little bit more on the mystic side of C.S. Lewis that brings that hope from heaven?
Lewis,
Can you repeat the question, so
could I expand upon the mystic side of Lewis?
as it relates to hope in heaven.
As it relates to hope in heaven. The mystics, Lewis read a lot of mystic writers, not only in English, but in other languages as well, especially medieval mystics. And he thought, as most people do, that the mystics, as I think I said, are on the fast lane to heaven. They're seeing something, which Lewis may have seen, according to Walter Hooper. You know, I didn't know, I didn't know. You know, oh my, that kind of thing. Now, the question is, can they somehow embody that in a language that tells we non-mystics what it's like? And Lewis thought that it could, but you have to be receptive. You know, it's not, if you're reading St. John of the Cross, or St. Teresa of Avila, or The Imitation of Christ, or The Cloud of Unknowing, you can't study it. It's not there to be studied. It's there to be immersed in. And the same is true with much of what Lewis wrote. Lend yourselves to it. If nothing happens, well, okay, maybe something else will do it to you. You know, there's a Lewis for everyone at every stage. But he took away from certain mystics very key elements of his thinking. Jakob Boehme, for example, wrote a book that gave him the phrase mere Christianity. And he was worried. Not many people have paid attention to this aspect of Lewis. He was worried about overdoing it. He wasn't like Billy Graham saying. He knew he wasn't of that sort of preaching school. He was more of the kind of person Deborah Winger described. Right? Bob Jones, you know Bob Jones, the fundamentalist preacher, Bob Jones University, heard about Lewis in the 50s because he was on the cover of Time magazine. You know that, right? When he wrote Screwtape. Very famous all over the world. And boy, did his correspondence blossom after that. So Bob Jones wanted to know what was up with this guy. So he went to see C.S. Lewis in Oxford, and he met Lewis. And he came back, and people wanted to know what he thought, because for his followers, Jones was the incarnation of Christian belief. And Jones said, well, that man does drink, and that man does smoke, but I believe he's a Christian. So Lewis never wanted to lean too far in that direction. And in his expository work, the nonfiction work, he doesn't, except every now and then it pops out, like at the end of The Problem of Pain. In the fiction, like in Perelandra or Narnia, it's all over the place. And it really is an invitation to this glory that Lewis believes is emanating from heaven all the time. Yes?
Said sermon after sermon by different celebrants about the importance of nature, outside, the environment, open space, green space, and on and on. I think it was in the Great Divorce that Lewis mentioned. One view of heaven was a green field and, you know, to the best of my knowledge, blue skies and beautiful countryside, and hell being sort of a city, dark, gray, etc. What fascinates me is your image of him as a child, interested in the environment and green, etc. So this was not a learned thing. This was an innate feeling from his heart. My question is, how did his view of heaven evolve, I guess?
Well, in Surprised by Joy, he talks about the Castlereagh Hills that surrounded him in Belfast. And, of course, in the distance, he said the hills seemed blue. And he always wanted to get to those mountains and to that blueness because he thought it was a kind of home. And that's when he first started to associate the countryside, which you see, by the way, Irish landscape is all over Narnia. If you ever go to Northern Ireland, there are portions of that, like the Hollywood Hills, you'll be in Narnia. Right? And that's how much it meant to Lewis. But especially those Castlereagh Hills. As a young boy, they were called to him. They called to him. And he put it in The Pilgrim's Regress, his first Christian work, a very complicated philosophical, theological work, really complex, demanding work, that he wrote in 2 weeks. And it features an island and hills. He was an environmentalist. Lewis, many places, talks about the damage being done by the scars of coal mining and the like. And he was also, well, he went on long walking tours, weeks-long walking tours over many, many miles every single year, sometimes twice a year in the 30s and part of the 40s. And loved animals, always had animals, and wrote an essay against vivisection, which had an impact, because people would experiment on live animals, and Lewis detested that. He had a dog named Papworth, Mr. Papworth. The dog became so old that he refused to eat standing still or if anyone was watching. So this great man Lewis, who was already famous at the time, he's walking down Kills Lane, throwing dog food over his shoulder so that Mr. Papworth can follow. And if Lewis turned around to see, Papworth would just stop eating. And had cats all the time. He loved mice, well, Reepicheep. There's one famous episode when he's walking along a path with a friend, and he sees a sodden mass entangled in a bush. And apparently some field mice had made a nest of it. And they weren't home at that point, right? But it was all twigged up with leaves and so on. And he looked close at the sodden mass, and he said, "That looks like my hat that I lost last year." "By God, it is my hat." And he picked it up and plopped it on his head and kept walking. He was a quirky guy. I've had occasion to study the manuscript of the Screwtape Letters, which is at the Berg Collection at the New York Public Library. And he hardly makes connections. I mean, this man could write fluently like nobody's business, and every now and then you see a correction. And as I was reading the Screwtape Letters, the book, I was impressed by Lewis's style. He's one of the great stylists. He really should be anthologized in the Norton anthologies just to guide undergraduates in how to write. And I saw at one point, he has Uncle Screwtape telling the patient, as I mentioned earlier, to have him fix his attention on his own feelings. And I stopped, being interested in style, I stopped and I said, "Fix? What a perfect word. 3 letters, 1 syllable, Anglo-Saxon, unmistakable. God, here's an example of Lewis's stylistic, rhetorical genius. Fix his attention, attach it, right? Now I get to the manuscript, and I read along, and I see that Lewis wrote rivet his attention. But he spelled rivet R-E-V-I-T. So he crossed it out, because he somehow knew it was wrong. He tried again, writes R-I-V-I-T. Crosses it out. Writes finally R-I-V-E-T, which is correct. But by that time, his confidence was so shot, he just crossed that out too and wrote fix in bold letters above it. So I was happy to see that C.S. Lewis sometimes couldn't spell. But have you heard about his memory? He used to have dinner parties for students. Now, Lewis could read in several different foreign languages, including ancient languages. And at one of these parties, a very famous student, I think it was Kenneth Tynan, I'm not sure, who became, a kind of left-wing avant-garde theater person, but loved Lewis, was devoted to Lewis. And Kenneth Tynan said, "It's terrible not to be able to remember anything you read." And Lewis said, and by the way, many people have told this story who witnessed it more than once. Lewis said, "You think that's bad, do you? Far worse not to be able to forget anything you've read." Well, of course, that's a challenge, isn't it? Who's going to believe that nonsense? So they would challenge Lewis. And Lewis would have them pick a series of numbers. 1 for a bookcase, 1 for a shelf on the case, and 1 for a book on the shelf. Random selection. The instruction was, pluck the book, turn to any page you please, and start to read it. Stop wherever you please. Now you realize the book could be in one of 6 or 7 different languages. Lewis would complete the page from memory. So maybe he was on the spectrum, I don't know, but he couldn't spell. So, or do math, by the way. His mother was a very gifted woman, an extraordinary mid-19th century woman who had a degree in mathematics and logic from Queen's College in Northern Ireland. Imagine that. And she taught him French at an early age, started him with Latin at an early age, tried to teach him mathematics. Do you know Lewis twice failed, a test called responsions, a basic algebra test for getting into Oxford? He failed it. The only reason C.S. Lewis got into Oxford is because, now Mark, as an Irishman, he was not subject to the draft. So he volunteered for service in World War I. That got him exempted from responsions. Otherwise, no glorious Oxford career because he could not do basic algebra. Probably could remember the formulas though, right? But just couldn't. Anyway, thank you all very much. It's been great.